Back, let's now return to that top story, and the coronavirus is raising all sorts of questions. Now, the outbreak comes 17 years after the SARS crisis. That virus killed nearly 800 people across the globe. So here's the key question: have officials learned any lessons from this? Let's get the latest from our reporter, MARILLIER, who's tracking the story for us. Michael, thank you so much for your time. I mean, we know that the Chinese had to deal with the SARS just previously, but I mean, now what are they saying about this outbreak of coronavirus?
Well, they are saying that they've learnt a lot of lessons about the way that you have to respond to a virus like this. And it is part of the broader group of viruses. SARS was part of the same family as the coronavirus. And just a quick interesting fact before we get into the figures, Tumelo, it's called the coronavirus because it has these spikes, as you can see behind me. When you put it under a microscope, it looks very much like a crown, and corona is another word for a crown. So that's why we're calling it the crowned killer. Now let's focus very quickly and get started on those numbers and look at it in comparison to SARS. Actually, so far more than 6,000 coronavirus infections. SARS, there were around about 8,000 infections. In terms of deaths, 132 deaths for the coronavirus. SARS claimed nearly 800 lives when it spread across the world in 2002 and 2003. When you look at the death rates compared to SARS, for instance, the death rate for coronavirus is much less. It's about 1 in 45 infections, Tumelo, whereas SARS, the death rate was 1 in 10 infections. So basically 10% of those infected were actually losing their lives. Now let's focus on the infections outside of China. We'll get a perspective on that. First of all, in Africa, we had the first test case on Monday. That was in the Ivory Coast. Officials testing a student who had arrived from China and not confirmed yet that whether she actually has the virus itself. We've also heard reports that the Zambians are taking precautions, as there are several students which study in China from that country. But as I mentioned, SARS, 800 deaths. That really forced the Chinese to look at the processes and the way they respond to these things. And we've also had the MERS virus. That emerged in 2012, Tumelo. 700 people losing their lives to the MERS virus. That one originated in the Middle East. So plenty of lessons to be learned. Let's hope that officials do respond in the right way. And if we just focus on some of the warnings that have been issued, both the United States and Canada have issued travel warnings to their citizens saying don't go to China if you can avoid it. Japan has evacuated several of its citizens. A plane carrying about 200 people, in fact, left the Wuhan area earlier this morning. So that's just what they're doing. South Africa choosing not to issue any travel warnings per se, although the health minister did say that he advises South Africans to avoid the Wuhan area specifically if they can. This is what the Institute for Communicable Diseases said. We're prepared to deal with a possible imported case, and we've put systems in place to identify, detect and respond to any cases. That statement came out on Monday, so suggesting that they are on top of the problem and they're doing their best to prevent an outbreak here.
And I mean, Michael, right now we do know that a majority of the infections are in Asia, but when it comes to the continent of Africa, I mean, what is the state of preparedness and how are officials responding?
Yeah, well, South Africa has said that it's doing its best to screen anybody who's coming or traveling from China. It would seem, for the most part, that screening is being done at our major ports of entry, Tumelo. So that would be encouraging. We just hope that we're able to deal with it. And as we said, we've learned from what happened in 2002, 2003, when SARS wreaked havoc across the globe.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael, for that update. The coronavirus, of course, is making waves in Asia. We're seeing there with the amount of those infected so far. But we know that there are some cases reported in Africa, one in Ivory Coast, which hasn't been confirmed as a contraction as yet. But, of course, we are following that story very closely.